Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. Tonight, I will be reading chapter 15. And this will be presented in two parts. Wysteria, chapter 15. Lying in bed, anxious to be reunited with his sweetheart, Will began wondering where he would find Emily tonight. Though unsure what sense had led him to her last night, he felt certain he could now detect her presence as well as her location in Wysteria. I hope she doesn't try to hide in some obscure, faraway place tonight. Like the moon, he thought. The trek to the castle was long enough. It would be convenient if he could materialize right next to her, if she were already there, of course. But that seemed unlikely, for, as it was, he couldn't control where he woke up. And how could he know where Emily was until he actually landed in Wysteria? As he started to drift away, Will concentrated on her image, feeling her touch and hearing her laughter. Then, just before leaving the waking world, he inhaled the imagined scent of lilacs. The next thing Will saw was the town square crystallizing around him. Though his mind was still foggy, he realized that the connection he tried to establish with Emily had been lost when sleep had taken him. Before the familiar setting fully materialized, he refocused his attention on her. His surroundings then grew dim and hazy, and he fell back into the darkness from which he'd begun to emerge. For a moment, Will feared he would return to his bed, but then a new scene formed in front of him. He now found himself standing in the grounds outside his castle, and ahead of him he saw Emily sitting beneath one of the blooming trees. "There you are," he said, announcing his arrival. Emily turned her head and looked his way. Surprised, then smiling, she jumped to her feet and ran over to greet him. "You found me again," she said, giving him a hug and kissing him squarely on the lips. "Yes, I did," he replied. "But it was different tonight." "How so?" she asked. Will described what had happened, from his thoughts as he lay in bed at home, to his final emergence here. "Interesting," she said. "I know that some builders can hop within their own worlds. It's not considered traveling, though, because they never actually leave their worlds. But what you described almost sounds like some kind of skipping. It makes me wonder." While Emily mused, they wandered over to a nearby tree and sat, each leaning against its trunk, causing pearly pink petals to fall like snowflakes on and around them. "What do you mean by hopping and skipping?" he asked. "Are those technical terms?" "Yes," she replied. "It's called hopping when a builder moves around in his own world. Skipping when a traveler moves to a different location within the same world. And jumping when someone travels from one world to another. Hop, skip, jump. Of course, as you might expect, there are other terms, but those are the most common. I like the term skip," she said. "I sometimes use it to refer to any type of traveling. I just think it sounds cuter." Emily smiled broadly, and Will laughed. You're adorable, he said. Since they declared their love for each other, he could freely give voice to his feelings. In any case, she continued, now with a slight blush on her cheeks, hopping is the ability to move from place to place very quickly, almost instantaneously, she said. I can't speak to how it's done, and I'm sure there are various methods, but it's a form of creation, a manner of manipulating the world. It may also involve altering one's body. However, you said that things went black as you left the square, which makes me curious. Why is that? He asked. If I want to jump between worlds, I first have to go back into the dark, Emily explained. I don't fall back asleep. My mind remains conscious, and I'm not there very long. Jumping is fast if you know where you're going and how to get there. At this point, I could probably jump to Wysteria as fast as I could return to the waking world. Skipping is even quicker, but since it's a form of traveling, I still have to journey through the emptiness. Hopping, on the other hand, shouldn't involve moving into the blackness, because the dreamer doesn't leave his world. So, what do you think I did just now? Will asked her. Was it hopping or skipping? I have no idea, she confessed, shaking her head. It might be something completely different. But if you did manage to get back into the darkness and remain awake, then maybe... Maybe what? He said. Emily thought for a second. I'll have to ask Jeremy about it, she responded. Since he can build and travel, he might understand. I wish you could speak to him yourself, though. You have so many questions that I can't answer. I have a feeling he would enjoy talking to you. But then, there's no predicting him. They sat for a time, each immersed in their own thoughts, until Will interrupted their reflective silence. I almost forgot, he said. I have something to show you. He stood and helped Emily to her feet. Where? She asked. In the castle, he said, walking her toward the entrance. It was a new creation, a feature that had occurred to him earlier that day at home, while he thought about her and reflected on their short history together. Though Will hadn't yet seen it for himself, he trusted it would be there. And when they passed through the gate, he wasn't disappointed. For on their left, there now stood a low wall, 8 feet high, enclosing an area, roughly square, in the northwest corner of the inner courtyard. That's new, said Emily, stopping and eyeing the stone partition. What's on the other side? Without answering, Will led her over to a single wooden door set in the wall of the enclosure and asked her to open it. She put her hand on the latch, then paused. No girl-eating goblins, she said. Not that I know of, he replied, smiling. As Emily pushed open the door, they were suddenly hit with a sweet, heady aroma. Lilacs, she exclaimed, taking a deep breath through her nose. Stepping through the doorway, they entered a courtyard filled with the fragrant shrubs. Emily ran to a nearby bush and buried her face in the purple blossoms. It's heavenly, she said. Yes, it is, he thought, drinking in the divine scent. Her scent. "What inspired this?" she asked. "You. Your story about the place you visited as a child," he said. "I'd always planned to create something like this, somewhere in the main garden though. But I decided it should be closer to home." They wandered along the flagstone pathways, stopping now and then to sample the smell of the different varieties Will had planted there. Then, having drunk their fill, the couple said farewell to the fragrant garden, left the castle, and, with no destination in mind, began winding their way through the outer grounds, heading south. "The water sounds nice today," Emily remarked as they neared the gorge. It did seem particularly pleasant, he thought. "It's purring," she said. Will walked to the edge of the canyon and closed his eyes, opening himself to the sound, letting it pour into and through his body. Then, beneath the dulcet roar, he heard a melody and a voice. "Do you hear singing?" he asked, opening his eyes. "Singing?" she said. Stepping next to him, Emily cocked her head to one side and listened closely. She began scanning the river below her, slowly following it upstream toward the falls. "Look," she said, suddenly, pointing to a spot where the rapids began. At first, Will could see nothing but a tangle of churning water and jagged stone. But then, through the thin veil of mist cast off by the falls, he noticed a figure, a woman. She sat precariously on a large sloping rock, staring down into the water, her legs dangling in the stiff current. And though it was hard to be sure from here, she appeared to be singing. As he focused his attention on her, the hazy image sharpened. The woman was very young, perhaps only in her teens. She had long golden locks, gray eyes, and a faint mask of freckles on her porcelain cheeks. Her flowing gown, a pale but luminous blue, was sleeveless and sheer, and was cinched around her slender waist with a sash. "Have you ever seen her before?" Emily asked him. "That isn't your blonde woman, is it?" "No," he told her. "It seems like a dangerous place to be sitting," she noted. "One slip and off she goes, down the rapids." "Yes," said Will, thinking the same thing. Who was she? Was she a part of his world or from another? In either case, Will couldn't help wondering how she got down there and how she would get back up. The side of the cliff seemed far too steep to climb, and traveling along the narrow rocky bank of the river would be difficult. As her bewitching song came to an end, the girl lifted her head and gazed at the curtain of falling water to her right. Then, as if suddenly aware that eyes were upon her, she looked up in their direction. The lovely young creature stared back at them and smiled. Then, closing her eyes, she raised her arms above her head and began sliding down into the water. Will expected the current to take hold of her and carry her away, but instead, she somehow held her position, submerging slowly, almost leisurely, into the tumultuous stream, until all that remained above the surface were her upstretched arms, which lingered there for a moment before slipping from sight. And we will continue with part 2 in just a moment.